everybody, Anna K. Moss here, and I'm here with the incredible Lucy McLaren, and we're going to have a little chat today
We are.
about books, a little conversation about fantasy. We're both members of the Fantasy and Sci-Fi Writers Alliance, which is an amazing alliance. If you're a fantasy or sci-fi writer, totally check us out either via mine or Lucy's Instagram. Our founder is called EB Hunter. You can also find him on Instagram and Twitter and all the good places. So yeah, come and join our gang. So Lucy and I have got to know each other through the alliance, and we just figured it was about time we had a chat about our books. We've got some crossover themes and stuff going on, and so yeah, I'm gonna dive right in and ask you about Awakening, which I have over here on my beautiful Kindle. I absolutely love this book. I thought the characterization was superb. The dialogue is freaking excellent. I was really blown away by that. It was incredibly smoothly done, beautifully paced throughout, but the dialogue pacing I thought was particularly smooth, effortless. It really felt like I was there and engaged with what was going on. It felt incredibly natural. So yeah, I mean, I loved Awakening, but I guess tell everybody about it. What's the deal?
Well, thank you very much, Anna. So yeah, here it is in the flesh. I've very casually posed it in the background as well. So Awakening is the first in the Commune's Curse trilogy. So there will be 2 more books, but it's basically it's a multi-perspective. So there's 4 main characters, YA, dark fantasy, very character focused. Like whenever you're in the head of either of the 4 main characters, you're very much seeing a lot of internal dialogue and a lot of inner conflict and stuff, which is a big thing for me when I'm reading. I love being in characters' heads that closely. So I really wanted to basically emulate like Robin Hobb. Like I'm never going to be anywhere near her skill level, but that's where I'm trying to be.
I think you're underselling yourself there, man. I thought it was serious Robin Hobb vibes. Like I loved it. Not just like kind of theme and character wise, but absolutely that effortless style in which you bring those inner kind of character turmoils to the fore. Oh, it was amazing.
Thank you. That really means a lot. Thank you. But yes, I guess you all know what it's about. So it's set in a kingdom ruled by an authoritarian kind of government called the Commune. You don't really see a lot of them specifically. Like the leader is called the Grand Magister, but he's very much in the background until later in the trilogy. But we're learning more about them. What they're doing is hunting down children who are born with these powers. Which again remain quite mysterious in book 1. That's something we'll learn more about later in the trilogy. But you kind of find yourself, like I said, the 4 main characters, 3 of them are trying to basically protect themselves against the Commune, and one of them is a soldier for the Commune. And I really wanted to have that kind of both sides sort of thing. Like we're not sure, like good and evil always seems to be a big element of obviously fantasy novels, but I didn't want to make it so clear cut as like this is the bad guy and these are the good guys. Like actually we explore a lot of what they're going through as people, and there's a lot of overlap in terms of mental health issues going on, a lot of self-doubt, and like I said, inner turmoil, questioning themselves, questioning loyalties. So really I think ultimately it comes down to being a lot about the people rather than this big epic quest, because like I said, that's what I enjoy reading.
Nice. Brilliant. I loved it. do we have is the second one in the makings then at the moment?
It is, yeah. It's written because when I wrote the first draft back in like 2018, I was like the drive, I was like, I've got to write the second one. So I really quickly wrote it, and it's just been kind of sat for a few years while I was trying to get the first one ready for publication, all that kind of stuff. So it's now going through editing. I've got to add some stuff in. It needs bumping up, it needs aligning with book 1 and getting to a place that it's publication ready. So that will be out around this time next year. So we're aiming for late 2023.
Amazing. Oh man, I can't wait. And it's interesting you saying about that, because timeline on things. I think especially as indie authors, if we're working outside of publisher deadlines and stuff, then they can feel sort of pressured. It's like, oh, why is this taking me so long to put this book together or whatever? But it does. It takes an incredibly long time. Sometimes you see on, I don't know, on Instagram or Twitter or whatever, somebody going, oh yeah, just smashed out this book in like a couple of months or whatever. And you're like, oh no, I must be crap in like comparison. It's taken me like three years or something. But for the vast majority of us, we've got to balance, work and home life and everything outside of that. It takes a bloody long time.
It does. Well, I'm published with a small press in America, but the timeline is never going to be quick. You do see people that are like, yeah, you can get a crack out a book and publish it on Amazon in like 2 months. Well, no, not if you want to go through the full process of like rewrites, edits, like sensitivity readers if you need them, all the like beta readers. It's all important parts of the process. And the reason it took me so like 3 or 4 years to get the book actually from first draft to publication was because of all those steps, and I was learning as I was going and like making mistakes and doing things that took up time, like editing as you go rather than like writing it and then editing, which I have since learned is just a massive waste of time. Like being so finicky with your first draft is just absolutely pointless, because you're gonna chances are it's going to look completely different by the time you're done. No point in worrying about a blooming word or a sentence or a comma, it's just don't focus on that.
Just move on, get through it.
Yeah.
Why was it that you wanted to be a writer in particular? Was it something that inspired you, an event in childhood? Was it literally just a love of books and things? Did it come as a kid or later in life? Or
yeah, so I did always enjoy writing when I was younger, because I've always loved fantasy books since I was a kid, like video games and films and stuff like that. Like, the Lord of the Rings trilogy came out when I was like 11, 12, and my God, it just blew me away. So I did start writing around that kind of similar time. I don't have any of the stuff I had when I was that age. I wrote when I was that age, unfortunately, because I was so like mired in shame and like lack of confidence. I was like, this is just crap, and just like destroyed it, which is really sad looking back, because I would love to like know what I wrote back then. Absolutely no idea. So I didn't write for like a really long time, between like late teenage years and my late 20s, when I started trying to be a counsellor, and that requires you to have your own counselling when you become a counsellor. And suddenly I was like, oh yeah, there's this thing that I really love and has always been at the back of my mind, but I've never really committed myself to it. And I was like, you know what, I was a full-time student at the time, so had a lot of free time on my hands, so to speak. I was like, I'm going to write a book. And I've still got like the little journal entry where I was like, this is it, I'm going to do it. And it was like March 2018. And I did. I wrote that book by November of that year. And thanks to NaNoWriMo, that was a big help. And yeah, that was it. Like that, I think once you kind of get serious about it and have that like spark, it's very difficult to turn that off. Like I can't remember what I used to think about in my free time, because now it's just like stories and like planning things out. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. What did I used to do all this free time? I don't know.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm not thinking about books or how to make. Like I find that when I meet somebody that's really interesting, or I overhear a bit of a conversation or something, I'm like, whoa, this needs to be a story. And then your mind sort of, spins. You're like, oh, this could happen and this could happen. And yeah, like as you say, like what did we think of before we started writing?
Like your brain didn't wake you up at like 1 a.m. like a random story idea that you've got to quickly write down, or you go, oh, I'll remember it, and then the next morning it's just gone. And yeah.
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 Oh, nice. And as I mentioned, earlier, around kind of the pacing and stuff of dialogue and things in Awakening, but overall the pacing of the Awakening. The pacing in general is brilliant. So it was. I felt it. I wrote this down earlier. I felt it rolling along, gathering speed and excitement, and the last few chapters were particularly satisfying. It just felt this, like the dialogue is throughout, this really effortless, like growing and building, and then catching this sort of pace with it. And I was wondering how much of that was carefully sort of planned out, or did it just sort of happen naturally as you were writing it?
Yeah, I would love to say I planned that, but I am so impatient that I tend to just write and see what happens. So I think that likely if we went back and looked at my first draft, it would not be anywhere near that kind of smooth pacing, if we want to call it that. I'm sure it was all over the place. I think I need to give a lot of credit to my editor, Nicole, for really helping me like tighten things up. We ended up, I think the first draft was like maybe 90 or 100,000 words. We ended up adding like 20,000 and then cutting a little bit. So I think that was kind of swapping scenes around, adding in certain bits. So I definitely think that editing process had a lot to do with that final, the pacing that we get. But yeah, I think almost naturally these kind of stories do build to that climax, because I think I saw similar in your own book. It's, you're putting all these pieces together in order to get to that final kind of like crescendo, right? And especially when it's a trilogy, it was kind of trying to manage like what is going to be resolved in this book and what's going to be left for book 2 and onwards.
And as I mentioned at the beginning of our chat, that we have some crossover really in terms of our themes, and I think how we write it. And I think the more I get to know about your writing process as well, I think we have some crossover really in terms of how we approach writing too, which is really good and interesting. And I want to know more. And I'm like, yes, new writer friend, cheer each other on.
Yeah, got a little flag. Woo!
And the question that I wanted to ask you about, because there's a lot of hard scenes that I wrote in The Worthy, was what was your hardest scene to write in The Awakening?
I think, and I can't go into too much detail about this, probably the last scene between Commander Suleiman and Lord Torrent. Can't really say much else. It's very much, that relationship is very toxic, and it's kind of like, I kind of advertise this as like it's a love story, but it's not a good love story. Like and you kind of learn more as you go into it. It's very, there's like there's gaslighting, there's abuse. It's there's something I did want to represent realistically, because I feel like a lot sometimes, well, unfortunately, I've seen examples of toxic relationships being somewhat idealized in stories that I've read or heard about, and I did not want that to be the case. So there's a lot of learning on Commander Suleiman's part throughout the book. He's probably the character who, as someone who is a soldier of the commune, he's a bit blind to things going on around him. But as the book goes on, his eyes are opened in a lot of ways and to a lot of things. So that felt like quite a powerful scene, but also a difficult one, because ultimately it could have gone two ways. And yeah, it was, for his character to develop, it had to go the way that it goes, for him to kind of move on into where it goes in book 2 and 3.
Oh, I can see how that would have been challenging to write, and especially because, of course, we get to know characters as we're writing them, and they're with us, and we know them inside out and personally, and love them or loathe them, or we want the best for them, even if they might be quite hateful characters. It's like you're right there with them. So if they have to face difficult stuff, I think as writers we face it with them. Yeah,
100%. So with that in mind, what was your hardest scene for The Worthy?
This is a really difficult question, actually.
There are a lot of grim scenes.
There is a lot of very emotionally difficult scenes within The Worthy, from a violent or abusive or, I suppose, frightening standpoint. There are, and from a trigger warning perspective, there is a lot of violence. There is sexual assault. There's all sorts, really. It's grimdark, so there's all pretty much every type of violence you can think of. I would actually say, though, that in terms of the hardest to write, because the book culminates with all of these characters being in kind of different places, whilst essentially the entire capital city of Krell, which is one of the countries in the novel, is falling apart. Citizens are rioting. There's enormous amounts of violence. There is literally hordes banging at the doors of places, and characters in extreme distress and danger, and all of that is happening at once. So although it wasn't emotionally difficult, it was very intellectually difficult to write those sort of final scenes, keep the pacing up as all of the action sort of starts to culminate, and that meant drawing maps, and then kind of plotting them out and changing them, literally from kind of scene to scene, where I would remember how many characters were here and where they were, how many I suppose, foes they were facing at any one time. So if we then came back to that scene, it hadn't felt like the scene had literally just stayed still for the whole time that this was going on. So keeping it sort of ever evolving, that was probably the biggest sort of intellectual challenge, I would say, in terms of writing. Complex.
You know what, that is really apparent when reading the scenes. I was like, Anna must have the most thorough map of this city, because especially in those final scenes, because it's the way you describe it and the characters like telling each other, we've got to go here, and it's like quite evident that you had that in front of you. You had it crystal clear in your mind where everyone needed to go and who was where. So that worked well, if it's any consolation, because that sounds like hard work.
I'm glad the effort paid off.
So talking about overlapping themes then, we've both got young children in our book. So you've got Trip, who I love, and her dog Hedge as a character, a viewpoint character that we see occasionally. And there's this real kind of figure of innocence, I think, amidst all the crap that is happening elsewhere in your book. And what was your motivation for including that kind of a symbol, it's this kind of, I loved her chapters because it was kind of like, as much as there's grim stuff going on around her, to be in the head of a child whilst all this stuff's going on felt very important. But I wondered what the motivation was for you to have her as a character.
Well, there was, so the book's written from 4 perspectives. We've got Barston and Aelith, the prince and princess of this particular nation of Krell, and they're vying for the throne individually. We've got Lord Grey, who we think maybe is working in somebody's favour at the beginning, but sort of then things start to fall down, and he's kind of crazy in some ways. I'm not going to give away too many spoilers. And then lastly, we have the perspective of Trip. Now, those two, Lord Grey and Trip, they didn't actually appear as points of view in my original draft at all. It was purely just chapters from Barston and Aelith's perspective. However, that did limit it to where they were at any one time. And as I've mentioned, that culmination of those final chapters, there's so much stuff going on that I realised fairly early on there wasn't 2 quite critical viewpoints for the reader. One, the machinations of actually what's going on with sort of court intrigue that's happening in the background of this story, and also how ordinary people within this fantasy setting are dealing with these enormous events that go on. And I think a lot of, especially kind of classic fantasy, the hero might be a fairly normal sort of person that then becomes amazing, but most characters are somehow fairly sort of powerful. To begin with, we see a lot of princes and princesses and lords and wizards and what have you. But I wanted to get in what was happening when all hell broke loose. And this little girl, Trip, she doesn't have any special powers. She's just an ordinary kid. She's just trying to make sense of what the hell is going on, whilst all these crazy people who are in power are really messing up the kingdom and causing really horrific things to go on, to happen. So that was where she evolved from, and I did want it to be from that perspective of innocence, that something can that somebody can be so affected by decisions which are made in a, kind of a faraway sense. And I think we see that a lot in modern politics and things. There are these decisions that are made, which then on a very critical, day-to-day level, have dramatic effects on people's lives. But policy and decision makers are very far from the reality of really what's going on. And so that's why I wanted Trip to be young. I wanted her to be something that was innocent and really just being pushed from pillar to post, really, as to what was happening. So it was partly a plot device, and partly my own political ideas coming into it.
Sneaking in. Oh, I love Trip though. I loved being in her head, and yeah, it does give you that unique perspective. I agree, because yeah, so many fantasy books are the main character is royalty or special in some way. Where Trip is just a kid trying to survive, basically.
Yeah. And how about the kids in yours? Because they play obviously a really starring role, and there's a lot of moments where I'm like, oh my gosh, I've really welled up and thinking, oh, how are they going to get through this? And I want to, as a reader, be reaching into the book and giving them a cuddle and reassuring them and say, look, it's all going to be okay. You're really brave. But yeah, what was sort of the motivation behind those characters for you?
So, I mean, I guess I'm going to put Evelyn under that umbrella as well, because she's 18, so to me that's a kid. So she finds herself having to protect Rafe and Rose, her brother and sister, and they're 14 and 6. So they're all kind of trying to make sense of what's going on. Like Rafe and Rose have lost their home village, which has been attacked by soldiers of the commune, and they end up basically being under Evelyn's care. She is I didn't want to make her a typical YA fantasy protagonist in that she's female, she's strong, she could do everything. Like, she does try and use a sword at one point and is just kind of very like inept. She hasn't got the strength, she hasn't got the training, she tries, but she's just dealing with so much of her own stuff, like past trauma and anxiety and like a borderline alcohol addiction kind of going on. So she's trying to do her best for Rafe and Rose, but she's very much stumbling through and struggling to do that. And then Rafe and Rose are dealing with the loss of their home, their family. Rafe is 14, but he's trying to kind of be like he's trying to prove himself as like a man, and like protect his sister, and he doesn't give her all the information about what's happened to their home and the losses that they've suffered. But unbeknownst to him, Rose is she's the most innocent figure, but she's also the one who poses the most threat in terms of it's kind of revealed quite early on that Rose has really strong powers, and these powers that are hunted down by the commune. So there's kind of a juxtaposition in her character in that she does some things that are really not suitable for a 6-year-old to do. She causes some horrific violence, but seems completely unaffected by it. It's almost as if she's like the 6-year-old child and the powers are two separate things. And we don't see Rose's perspective, and she's very quiet. She doesn't talk much. She has a dog companion, and the kind of implication is that they are able to communicate between each other, but we have no idea what that communication looks like. So I wanted to have that idea of children going through awful things aren't always going to be okay, and aren't always going to be able to like fight back successfully, and they're going to do things that are questionable in their attempts to kind of protect each other and protect themselves. And that's because ultimately, this book is about an authoritarian government that's trying to control kids and the kingdom in general. And there's probably some political thing there, but right now my brain isn't connecting them. But I'm the same as you in that I wanted that kind of, authoritarian government. I'm influenced by politics we see in the real world. So that idea of people being blinded to the atrocities going on around them, but kids are kind of the innocent victims in that. they don't have a choice in what's happening or being imposed upon them, and just trying to make the best of what's going on around them.
I know that we've touched on Brexit before in our conversations and things on Instagram, and there are themes of otherness in both of our novels. Would you say that you were directly influenced by the events of British politics in The Awakening?
Most definitely, yeah. So for me, it's kind of the otherness in terms of people with powers versus people without powers. This kind of created this them versus us narrative that we have seen in the UK over recent years. That is what kind of helps the community to maintain power, because they kind of say, look, if we don't control these people that have got powers, they're going to hurt you in some way. So that's where a lot of people kind of just like, yeah, you just get on with it and it's fine. And I think that happens a lot in real life when there's that otherness created. This group of people are made into the villains, and that narrative is kind of driven into people's minds by media and stuff like that. And it's almost like a mass brainwashing in a way, and people just kind of like, okay, that's fine because they're the bad people, so we need to just let the government do what they need to protect us from them. So definitely Brexit was an influence, like the Windrush saga, like the shit show that's been going on with the Windrush generation, people who were promised citizenship like a generation ago, and suddenly losing their UK passports and being deported in some cases, I believe. So it was that was a big influence around Commander Suleiman's storyline, and he is from he's not from the Kingdom of Septima, he's from the Noman Islands outside of that. And so you see people from his home islands being treated in that kind of similar way to the Windrush generation that we've seen in the UK. They have a home in Septima, but that's being uprooted. The Grand Magister is suddenly putting in place these laws that is making it very difficult for them to settle, or is making them move from their established areas in the kingdom. And yeah, it was I would say it's definitely directly influenced. I wanted to be as sensitive as possible, because obviously I'm not someone who's from a Black or ethnic minority background, so I had sensitivity readers kind of look at the book from that perspective. But for me, I think it's important to explore these kind of issues because they are going on right now, British politics is a mess. Obviously, worldwide, there are several just horrific events going on based on political standpoints. And I for me, it was kind of a way of processing how I feel about what's going on in my own country. What about you?
Yeah, very much same with the Worthy. So a lot of it was shaped sort of post Brexit referendum on I suppose the almost kind of euphoric levels of excitement from some quarters around us, finally sort of throwing off the shackles of European control, and that there were these sort of brave kind of heroes who were somehow, had painted themselves as these saviors who were, we've got to retain our own sovereignty, and that just, it still feels to me a great deal like Britain has this colonial hangover. I don't know if that's really the right word, but this very, very odd sense of greatness, and that we are, absolutely number one in the world. And of course, we, in a very horrific sense, owned huge portions, of the world, or controlled, should I say, which led to obviously huge amounts of destruction over many, many years. And I think that there still seems to be this very odd idea that we are the greatest, we're the sort of the best. And I know America can do that pretty well as well too. But this idea that, of course we can stand on our own and because we're the greatest and we're the best. And how I wanted to bring that into the Worthies, there are these two nations, Krell, where Barston and Aelith are from, and the nation of Jin Tin. Krell is a feudal, typical sort of fantasy medievalism place. And Jin Tin, to all intents and purposes, although it does have its own issues, is pretty much a socialist utopia, and is laughed at by people from Krell. People in society are supported regardless of their age or background. They are treated fairly and evenly, and wealth is distributed, public wealth. And I wanted that to be a reflection of how I see this quite strangeness that we're seeing with British politics nowadays, is that we're so far from the idea of public wealth now within Britain. Private wealth, absolutely, but public wealth, so far from it. That, you know, if it's mine and I can keep it, then I will maintain this sort of richness, and those that are over there who are other, they're not going to take it away from me. But I very strongly believe that, of course, if we don't actually share what we have, we may be privately wealthy but publicly very, very poor, which we're of course seeing now with our national health system, with our schools, with pretty much every public service that you can think of. So I could have money in my bank account but not be able to get a doctor's appointment for the next 6 months. And this sort of squaring up of where we see ourselves, I wanted to express that within the book, and hope that I've done to a certain extent.
So, final joint question about theme overlapping then. So I think moral greyness is a feature in both our stories. I'd say more yours, because yours is grimdark and mine is dark fantasy. So I do have more of a glimmer of hope, perhaps, than yourself. But did you feel like it was an important element for you to be able to, like, it's very much a blurred line between good and evil, and having those characters walk in that fine line, even characters that, you know, like Aelith, who is clearly trying to do her best, but, you know, it's just, she's struggling, right? She perhaps doesn't have all the information available to her, but I wouldn't necessarily call her morally grey, but it's more, I don't know, perhaps moral naivety, maybe.
Yeah, she makes some bad decisions, definitely. I think even when she's actually trying to do her best, she does it not always very effectively, in a way which unfortunately does have bad ramifications for some of the other characters. That moral greyness, I suppose, it comes about really with a couple of things. One being, I'm heavily influenced by Joe Abercrombie, by the likes of other writers like Brian McLaren, and I think even writers that we might see as being, you know, potentially more hopeful and actually would just be in the fantasy bracket rather than dark fantasy. But I think with modern writers, we're seeing much more of that effective kind of moral greyness. I think you do it brilliantly in your story as well. That and I think all of us can relate to this, that no matter how much we might really, really try to be good people and do the right thing, that we are going to, at points in our life, make decisions which hurt other people, even if it's not if it's in an indirect way. And I think that much more closely reflects the human experience than always being able to do the right thing, or always doing the wrong thing for awful reasons. I think everyday human experience is much more complicated than that. And I think all of us, even if we believe that, you know, in essence, we're good people, can carry shame about decisions that we've made. Could think, fuck, I wish I'd bloody done that differently. Or maybe I wouldn't do that differently again. Maybe I would knock their block off, actually, if I had that conversation again. I think all of us can, to a certain extent, see that there is darkness, I suppose, within us. And I think that's much more closer to human experience than classic fantasy might have us think, maybe. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I as much as I love, like, you know, Lord of the Rings, that kind of clear cut, this is the good side and this is the bad side, is just not true to real life. So similar to you, I just I wanted to have characters who are, some of them are, well, it's actually all of them to some extent or another, are just trying to do their best, trying to help other people. You know, even Commander Suleiman, who is the one who's kind of on the bad side, he is misinformed, he's naive, he is blindly loyal to the man that he loves, and that kind of paints the way he sees the world. But also, it's also based on past experiences with a lot of my characters. I as a counselor, I kind of take a lot into account, like what happened to them in childhood and what does that mean for them now. So for example, Lord Torrent, who is the kind of the antagonist in this book, he is a bastard, but he's a bastard for a reason. And like one of the prologues is him as a child, and you see kind of what happened to him when he was younger, and why he has turned out to be how he is. So yeah, but maybe moral greyness isn't the right thing, the way to call it, but it's more of that. There is such a blurred line between what's good and what's bad, depending on where you're standing, depending on what your experiences and beliefs are. It's like, for example, in your book, like Lord Grey thinks he's doing the best for the kingdom, and that just becomes twisted and manipulated as the book goes on. And it's kind of like that, isn't it? Like people are doing what they think is best based on their own personal beliefs, and that very much twists the actions they then go on to take, and the impact that has on other people. And perhaps whether it falls on the good or bad side depends on how much they pay attention to that impact on other people or ignore it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. What we do with it, I suppose, what we do with that information of our impact and understanding of what are the consequences of our own actions.
Yeah. Your world building is amazing, like so vividly written. I was like, as I was reading it, I was writing notes of like the descriptions that you give, because they're gorgeous. Like that one in particular was the whelks gripping the castle like rancid mollusks on a hull, and I was like, it's beautiful. It's a horrible image, but it's also like so good and so evocative. So yeah, with the cliffside city of Jintin, which was like just so easy to imagine. Krell is really grey and drab, and just kind of I imagined a lot of, it's just like a grey medieval city, very dirty streets, and just imagine it would stink, just all that kind of stuff. So were there any particular places in real life, is there anywhere that you've been that influenced those areas in your book?
It's there is a bit of a I suppose, influences, I guess, not direct similarities. So Krell, purely in terms of environment, is closest to, I would say, northern parts of Scotland, because in winter they are in absolutely sort of deep snow and freezing weather, but they do have springs, and they do have summers. They're not in, sort of snowy wastelands. Jintin is more around kind of Middle East, and especially when describing the architecture, I did, although unfortunately I've never been to the Middle East, although from all of the research that I was doing over the last few years, it's like I just so many incredibly beautiful places. The architecture in particular I just found absolutely stunning. The intricate nature of Middle Eastern architecture I think is beautiful, and so that was heavily influenced in terms of place and environment. But in terms like kind of how we brought those things to life, that's really funnily enough is a Pratchett influence. So I love how he writes his environments, because he gives them a personality. And Pratchett was one of the first fantasy authors that I got hooked on. So I think that's where I wanted to bring those environments to life. Oh, another one is Mervyn Peake as well. I don't know if you've ever read Gormenghast. Oh, no. Just absolutely stunning. Within the first couple of pages of that, a description of Gormenghast is just incredible, so evocative. And I wanted to do that with the environments, for them to not just really tell the reader what it is that they're seeing, but what they're hearing, what they're smelling, and actually what that means to the characters that are viewing it. I wanted the readers to be experiencing it through those characters' eyes, and to do that is normally giving personality to those places. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah, and it made it so much easier to imagine, and yeah, it really does put you in those places. So very, very nicely done. And so reading The Worthy, I was very drawn into this book. I'm so slow at reading at the moment, but oh my God, words. I read it so quickly, and the climax was very satisfying. Like we said earlier, I think you did find a good balance in terms of a lot of things came to a head, but it's definitely left me thinking, okay, what next? So, what are your plans in terms of a sequel?
So yeah, right now I'm actually writing a short story based on the siege of Drenhaven, which Aelith, she's coordinated this attack on this city of Drenhaven some years before the Worthy is actually set. And this has stayed with me, this idea of this siege. And so I wanted to write the short story of that, and I'm working on that at the moment. I was thinking, oh, this will just be like 1,000 words or whatever, and it's just getting like longer and longer. And I'm introducing more characters. I'm like, oh no, maybe this is actually a novella. I don't know. So anyway, just kind of carrying on. But it's working as well because I'm also introducing a character who I absolutely love, who I want to be in the sequel to Worthy. This character called Eventime, who is 18 at the time of the siege of Drenhaven, and is effectively an assassin. She's an amazing character. I love her. So I want her to be appearing within the sequel. And then the plotting fully starts. I have a document which is full of all of the ideas of what I want to cover within the sequel, but it's gonna take a good long time to do that plotting. I'm much more of a plotter. I like knowing what I'm going to do with every scene before I start it. What is the point of this scene? Because otherwise, I just
You've probably got a lot more patience than me because I start planning. I'm like, fuck it. I'm just gonna start writing and see what happens. It's interesting the different ways that people write, but that sounds great with the prequel kind of novella. It sounds like it's going to end up being, but it's interesting that when you have these characters and you become so invested in them, you do want to explore more of what happened to them beforehand, and I think that will just only serve to add to the kind of richness of the world that you've created. Like, do you plan on, will you publish that as like a novella at some point?
Yeah, I hope so. I see what it ends up as. If it is more sort of a short story length, then I might just sort of pop it out there. Or I might even enter it into some short story competitions. You never know. I've actually never entered a short story competition.
There you go.
So I'm thinking that I might do that, and I'm trying to write it in a way that is very much a standalone, and that you don't have to have read The Worthy in order to enjoy the Siege of Drenhaven. So yeah, we'll see how it goes. If anybody wants to be a beta reader for a grimdark short story, then let me know. Maybe you too. Then yeah, I'm very very much looking for beta readers. So
I highly recommend. By the way, Anna's writing is excellent.
Likewise with yours. Yeah, I love The Awakening, and I cannot wait for the second to come out. It's been amazing chatting with you today. I've really enjoyed it.
Me too. Thanks, Anna.